all set in motion by a desperate widow's impulsive purchase of an abandoned railway depot she could barely afford. A deteriorating 1880s station in a forgotten North Carolina mountain town that would eventually bring archaeologists from the National Museum of American History to her doorstep, trigger urgent preservation orders from the State Historic Commission, and ultimately reveal a concealed chamber containing Confederate treasury gold that had remained untouched for over 160 years. A discovery that would rewrite Civil War scholarship and transform one woman's story of financial ruin into an extraordinary legacy of historical preservation. But first, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story moves you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more amazing lined up for you. This is the story of Rebecca Chen, a 49-year-old former museum curator whose world collapsed when her husband's 3-year battle with ALS consumed not just their savings, their entire future. The woman who once authenticated historical artifacts for the Smithsonian and Metropolitan Museum was about to make a $500 purchase that seemed like the final mistake in a series of devastating financial decisions. Rebecca stared at the foreclosure, notice taped to her front door, the October morning air cutting through her thin cardigan as she fumbled with keys to her modest ranch house in Asheville, North Carolina. The stark white paper with its official seals and legal terminology represented the final countdown of a financial disaster that had been building for 3 years. Ever since David's diagnosis with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis had transformed their comfortable middle-class life into a desperate struggle for survival. The numbers were merciless in their precision. Total outstanding debt, $63,400. Current bank balance, $127.83. Days until forced eviction, 12. Each figure represented a piece of the life she and David had built together over 18 years of marriage, now reduced to mathematical calculations that showed no mercy for love, loss, or the devastating medical expenses that had consumed everything they'd worked to achieve. Inside the house, Rebecca spread the collection of past due notices across their kitchen table, the same oak table where she and David had once planned vacations to European museums and discussed their dream of opening a small gallery featuring regional Appalachian artists. The harsh, fluorescent light overhead illuminated a financial catastrophe that seemed impossible to escape. Mortgage payments for months behind totaling $8,400. Medical bills from David's treatments exceeding $34,000, despite insurance coverage, and credit card debt accumulated during his illness reaching $21,000. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca, that a woman who had spent her career evaluating the monetary and historical worth of artifacts was now completely unable to assign value to her own possessions in any way that could save her home. Her expertise in 18th and 19th century American decorative arts, once valued by major museums and private collectors, become professionally irrelevant in an art market that had shifted toward contemporary works and digital authentication, methods that made her traditional skills seem antiquated. David Chen had been an environmental engineer specializing in mountain watershed protection, work that had brought them to western North Carolina 15 years earlier, when the Environmental Protection Agency had contracted his firm to assess mining impacts on regional water systems. His methodical approach to scientific problems and Rebecca's artistic sensibility had created a partnership that balanced analytical precision with creative vision, evident in every aspect of their shared life, from the restored 1940s ranch house to the carefully curated collection of regional pottery and textiles that filled their home. The diagnosis had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, delivered by Dr. Patricia Holbrook at Mission Hospital. With the clinical directness that medical professionals use to communicate devastating news, the test results confirm amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, she had explained to Rebecca and David. Their hands clasped together in the sterile examination room, will develop a comprehensive care plan to manage symptoms and maintain quality of life for as long as possible. What Dr. Holbrook couldn't convey in that moment was how completely ALS would dismantle not just David's physical capabilities, but the entire infrastructure of their financial security. The progressive neurological disease had required increasingly expensive medical equipment, specialized therapies, and home modifications that transformed their modest savings into inadequate resources consumed by immediate survival needs. Rather than long-term planning, David's decline had been steady but merciless. The strong hands that had once operated complex environmental monitoring equipment gradually lost their dexterity, acquiring adaptive technologies that insurance companies considered experimental rather than essential. His clear voice, which had confidently presented research findings to EPA administrators and congressional committees, had been reduced to whispered communications through computer-assisted devices that cost more per month than their previous mortgage payment. Most devastating had been watching David's brilliant analytical mind remain completely intact while his body systematically failed, creating a cruel awareness of everything being lost while maintaining the intellectual capacity to understand each progressive limitation. He had continued working from home for 18 months after diagnosis, adapting his consulting practice to accommodate physical restrictions while Rebecca juggled her museum position with increasing caregiving responsibilities. The financial devastation had accelerated during David's final year, when round-the-clock care requirements had forced Rebecca to resign from her position as assistant curator of decorative arts at the Asheville Art Museum. Her salary of $52,000 annually had provided the stable foundation for their household budget, while David's consulting income had funded their savings and discretionary spending. Losing her income while medical expenses tripled had created an impossible mathematical equation that no amount of careful budgeting could solve. The life insurance policy that should have provided financial stability had become another casualty of David's illness. The $280,000 policy they had maintained for 12 years included a clause excluding coverage for pre-existing conditions that weren't disclosed at the time of application. David's initial symptoms, which had been attributed to stress and overwork rather than ALS, has been documented in medical records 18 months before his formal diagnosis, creating grounds for the insurance company to deny the claim that would have prevented Rebecca's current financial catastrophe. The rejection letter from Consolidated Life Insurance remained in Rebecca's desk drawer, its legal language explaining how failure to disclose relevant medical history had voided their policy despite 12 years of faithful premium payments. The company's investigation had discovered David's visits to his primary care physician for muscle weakness and fatigue, symptoms that seemed insignificant at the time, but were later identified as early indicators of ALS, providing legal justification for denying benefits when they were most desperately needed. Rebecca's attempts to maintain employment while caring for David had been complicated by the specialized nature of her museum expertise. Her knowledge of American decorative arts from 1750 to 1900 is highly specific but not easily transferable. Two other employment opportunities in western North Carolina, where the job market favored tourism, hospitality, healthcare, and manufacturing rather than cultural institutions requiring her particular academic background. The part-time positions she had managed to secure after leaving the museum provided minimal income that couldn't address the mounting debt accumulated during David's illness. Working 20 hours weekly at a local antique shop for $12 per hour generated only $960 monthly before taxes, while evening shifts entering data for a medical billing company added another $600 to her income, creating a total monthly earnings of approximately $1,300 that was insufficient to cover essential expenses, let alone address accumulated debt. The house that Rebecca and David had purchased in 2010 for $185,000 had seemed like a sound investment in Asheville's growing arts community. The 1947 ranch-style home on half an acre had provided space for David's home office and Rebecca's pottery studio, while appreciating property values had created equity that they had planned to access for retirement funding. The three-bedroom house, with original hardwood floors and mountain views, had represented stability and community, a connection in a region they had chosen for its cultural richness and environmental beauty. But the mortgage that had been easily manageable with their combined income had become impossible to maintain on Rebecca's part-time earnings. The monthly payment of $1,247 exceeded her entire income, creating an unsustainable situation that had led to the foreclosure. Proceedings now threatening to eliminate her last connection to the life she and David had built together. Selling the house would have been the logical solution, except that current property values in their neighborhood had declined due to increased inventory and economic uncertainty, meaning sale proceeds wouldn't cover the outstanding mortgage balance, plus accumulated penalties and legal fees. Rebecca's daily routine had become a careful choreography of survival, managing grief while simultaneously addressing practical challenges that required constant attention. Her mornings began at 5:30 a.m. with job searches and application submissions, targeting any position that might utilize her organizational skills and attention to detail. The remainder of her day was divided between her part-time work commitments and evening hours spent researching financial assistance programs, debt consolidation options, and legal aid resources that might provide alternatives to foreclosure. The emotional toll of simultaneous grief and financial crisis had created what Dr. Sarah Brennan, Rebecca's counselor at the Mountain Community Wellness Center, identified as compound trauma that made recovery from either challenge significantly more difficult. You're processing the loss of your spouse while simultaneously facing the loss of your home, financial security, and professional identity. Dr. Brennan had explained during their weekly sessions funded through sliding scale fees that Rebecca could barely afford. Each loss reinforces the others, creating a cycle that can feel overwhelming. The isolation that accompanied Rebecca's circumstances had been unexpected and difficult to manage. Friends from the museum community offered emotional support but had their own professional and family obligations that limited practical assistance. Colleagues from David's environmental consulting network provided sympathy but were located primarily in other states, making their support meaningful but not immediately helpful for addressing housing and financial challenges. The neighborhood, where Rebecca and David had lived for 15 years, had been populated by other professional couples with similar interests in arts, environmental issues, and community involvement. But the social connections that had flourished when Rebecca and David were active participants in local cultural events had gradually diminished as her circumstances changed, creating awkward interactions with neighbors who didn't know how to respond to her dramatic lifestyle changes. Rebecca's sister Jennifer, who lived in Seattle with her family, had offered to help with temporary housing. But relocating would require abandoning the job opportunities she had developed in Asheville. While starting over in a city where she had no professional connections or familiarity with local cultural institutions, the decision represented choosing between maintaining some elements of the life she had built with David versus accepting help that would require abandoning everything familiar during an already traumatic period. Most painful was Rebecca's recognition that David's death had eliminated not just her life partner, but also her primary emotional support during the worst financial crisis she had ever experienced. The person who would have helped her analyze options and develop strategies for addressing their debt was the same person whose illness had created the financial emergency. Leaving Rebecca to navigate complex decisions while processing grief, that made concentration and rational planning significantly more difficult. The medical bills that continued arriving months after David's death served as recurring reminders of both her loss and her impossible financial situation. Statements from specialists, equipment rental companies, and pharmaceutical providers created a paper trail of the final year's desperate attempts to maintain David's comfort and dignity, now transformed into financial obligations that threatened to eliminate any possibility of stability in Rebecca's future. The $500 that remained in Rebecca's checking account after paying essential utilities and groceries represented the complete extent of her liquid assets, money that needed to last until her next paychecks, while also covering gasoline for job, interviews, and basic household necessities. The amount was simultaneously everything she had, and completely inadequate for addressing any unexpected expense or opportunity that might require immediate financial commitment. Rebecca's morning routine of reviewing job listings and financial obligations had become a ritual of managed desperation, each day requiring careful calculation of which bills could be delayed, which opportunities might be worth pursuing, and which aspects of her former life needed to be abandoned to focus on immediate survival. The woman who had once confidently evaluated million-dollar art collections was now overwhelmed by the complexity of prioritizing competing financial obligations that all seemed equally urgent and impossible to address. The antique shop, where Rebecca worked part-time, had become a daily reminder of the irony in her situation. Surrounded by historical objects that she could accurately date, authenticate, and price for collectors, she was completely unable to identify anything in her own life that could be sold for sufficient funds to address her housing crisis. Her expertise remained intact, but its commercial value had evaporated in circumstances that required immediate cash rather than specialized knowledge. But it was during one of these desperate morning job searches that Rebecca's phone displayed a notification that would change the trajectory of her story. A real estate alert she had set up months earlier, when still hoping to find affordable rental housing, had identified a property auction in Millbrook, a small mountain community 40 miles northwest of Asheville. The listing showed a deteriorating 1880s railroad depot being sold by the county for unpaid taxes. With a minimum bid of just $500, the building, according to the sparse description, had been vacant for more than 40 years and required extensive repairs before being suitable for any practical use. But something about the listing caught Rebecca's attention in ways that she couldn't immediately explain, perhaps representing an alternative to the gradual loss of everything that had defined her life with David. As she stared at the auction, Rebecca realized she was looking at an opportunity that was either completely irrational or potentially transformative, and she no longer had enough left to lose to let fear make the decision for her. The real estate notification about the Millbrook Depot had appeared at the worst possible moment, when Rebecca's morning routine of reviewing foreclosure documents and overdue bills had reached its most desperate point. She stared at the listing. On her phone screen, it's the $500 minimum bid, representing exactly the amount remaining in her checking account after paying the electric bill that would keep her lights on for another month. The coincidence felt like either cosmic irony or divine intervention, though Rebecca wasn't sure she believed in either anymore. Millbrook, North Carolina, was a town she remembered visiting once with David during their early years in the region, when they had spent weekends exploring small mountain communities and documenting the architectural remnants of the area's railroad heritage. David had been fascinated by the engineering challenges of building rail lines through Appalachian terrain, while Rebecca had photographed the decorative elements of depot buildings that reflected Victorian-era optimism about transportation, connecting isolated communities to broader economic opportunities. The memory of that long-ago afternoon felt both precious and painful as Rebecca enlarged the auction listing photos on her laptop screen. The Millbrook Depot, built in 1883, according to the county records, showed the distinctive architectural features of rural Southern railroad stations from the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. Despite obvious deterioration from decades of abandonment, Rebecca could identify the quality craftsmanship in the surviving woodwork, the elegant proportions of the passenger waiting area, and the detailed millwork around windows and doors that had somehow endured 40 years of neglect. But recognizing the building's architectural significance only emphasized the impossibility of Rebecca's current circumstances. Her expertise in American decorative arts had trained her to appreciate the historical and aesthetic value of 19th century craftsmanship, yet this knowledge felt mockingly irrelevant when she couldn't afford to maintain her own modest home, let alone take responsibility for preserving a deteriorating public building that would require tens of thousands of dollars in restoration work. The practical challenges were immediately obvious, even from the limited auction information. The depot had been vacant since 1982, when the last railroad service through Millbrook had been discontinued due to declining freight traffic and passenger ridership. For decades of abandonment had created structural issues that would require professional assessment before the building could be occupied or used for any commercial purpose. The county's decision to auction the property resulted from accumulated property taxes and code violations that local government was unwilling to address through public funds. More concerning was Rebecca's complete lack of experience with historic preservation projects. Her museum work had involved evaluating and caring for artifacts within controlled environments, not managing the complex logistics of building restoration. That required coordination with contractors, compliance with historical preservation regulations, and navigation of local zoning requirements. The skills that had made her valuable as a curator had no apparent application to the overwhelming practical challenges of rehabilitating an abandoned railroad depot. Yet something about the listing continued to capture Rebecca's attention in ways that transcended logical assessment of the challenges involved. Perhaps it was the connection to memories of exploring similar buildings with David, when their future had seemed filled with possibilities for collaborative projects that combined his engineering expertise with her historical knowledge. Or perhaps it was the desperate recognition that conventional approaches to her financial crisis had proved completely inadequate, making an unconventional decision seem worth considering despite obvious risks. The auction was scheduled for the following Thursday, exactly 1 week before the foreclosure deadline that would force Rebecca from her home. The timing created an impossible choice between using her last financial resources for a speculative property purchase or maintaining those funds for essential expenses during what might be her final weeks in Asheville. The rational decision was obviously to preserve her remaining money for moving expenses and security deposits that would be required for whatever modest rental housing she might be able to secure. But rationality hadn't prevented the financial catastrophe that had consumed Rebecca's savings. It eliminated her career prospects and left her facing homelessness, despite years of responsible financial planning and professional achievement. Careful, logical approaches that had defined her previous decision-making had proved completely inadequate for addressing the extraordinary circumstances created by David's illness and death. Perhaps those same careful approaches were equally inadequate for recognizing opportunities that might exist outside conventional expectations. Rebecca spent the remainder of that morning researching Millbrook's economic and demographic profile, discovering a small mountain community that had experienced modest population growth as remote work opportunities allowed urban professionals to relocate to areas with lower housing costs and scenic environments. The town's main street featured a mix of local businesses and services that suggested economic stability without significant prosperity, while recent residential development indicated demand for housing among newcomers attracted to the region's cultural and recreational amenities. The information painted a picture of a community in transition, adapting to economic changes while maintaining connections to its historical identity as a railroad town that had once connected mountain agricultural products with urban markets. The depot's location on a prominent corner of Millbrook's modest downtown suggested potential visibility and accessibility that might support commercial uses if the building could be restored to functional condition. More intriguingly, Rebecca's research revealed that Millbrook was located within the designated boundaries of the Blue Ridge Heritage Trail, a state tourism initiative that promoted historical sites related to the region's transportation and industrial development. The program provided grants and technical assistance for preservation projects that created educational opportunities and economic development in rural communities, suggesting potential funding sources that might help address restoration costs. If a viable preservation plan could be developed, the possibilities were tantalizing, but required expertise and resources that Rebecca didn't possess. Historic preservation projects involved complex regulations, specialized contractors, and significant financial commitments that were completely beyond her current capabilities. The gap between recognizing potential value and having the means to realize that potential felt insurmountable, yet another reminder of how completely her circumstances had changed since David's death. But as Rebecca continued researching the depot and Millbrook's historical context, she began to recognize connections between the building's significance and her own professional background that might provide advantages she hadn't initially considered. Her museum experience had included managing acquisition projects that required historical research, condition assessments, and coordination with specialists in conservation and preservation techniques. While she had never managed building restoration, the underlying skills of project management, historical documentation, and resource coordination were directly relevant to preservation work. More significantly, Rebecca's academic background included a master's degree in American Studies with a concentration in material culture and decorative arts from Saboya, exactly the period when the Millbrook Depot had been constructed. Her graduate research had examined the relationship between transportation infrastructure and regional economic development in the post-Civil War South, focusing on how railroad construction had influenced architectural styles and community planning. In small towns throughout Appalachian regions, the specialized knowledge that had seemed professionally irrelevant in her current job search might actually provide crucial insights for understanding the depot's historical significance in developing appropriate preservation strategies. Her familiarity with Victorian-era construction techniques, understanding of regional architectural traditions, and experience with historical documentation could potentially compensate for her lack of direct preservation experience, especially if she could identify consultants and contractors with relevant expertise. But recognizing these potential advantages only emphasized the fundamental obstacle of financing any preservation effort when Rebecca could barely afford basic living expenses. The $500 auction price was merely the beginning of costs that would quickly escalate once restoration work began. Building permits, structural assessments, roofing repairs, electrical updates, and countless other requirements would create expenses that could easily reach $50,000 or more before the depot could be used for any productive purpose. The mathematical impossibility of the situation was undeniable. Yet Rebecca found herself unable to dismiss the opportunity entirely. Something about the depot listing had triggered a sense of connection and possibility that felt more authentic than any of the conventional employment opportunities she had been pursuing. Her job search efforts had consistently resulted in rejection letters that emphasized her overqualification for available positions or her lack of relevant experience for roles that might utilize her specialized knowledge. The afternoon brought another round of disappointing responses to recent job applications. A customer service position at a local bank had been filled by a candidate with more extensive experience in financial services. An administrative role at a regional medical center required certification in electronic health records that Rebecca didn't possess. Even a part-time position cataloging archives at a nearby university had been awarded to a recent library science graduate who could commit to full-time availability. Each rejection reinforced Rebecca's growing recognition that her professional skills and experience didn't align with available employment opportunities in Western North Carolina's job market. The specialized expertise that had once provided career security and financial stability was increasingly irrelevant in an economy that valued different qualifications and experience bases. At 49, Rebecca was competing against younger candidates who could accept lower salaries and older workers who had decades of experience in locally relevant industries. The age discrimination that affected Rebecca's job prospects was subtle but persistent, evident in interview feedback that emphasized cultural fit and energy rather than qualifications and experience. Hiring managers seemed uncomfortable with her museum background, viewing her specialized knowledge as impractical rather than valuable, while questioning whether someone with her education and experience would be satisfied with available positions that offered limited opportunities for advancement. Most frustrating was the recurring suggestion that Rebecca consider relocating to urban areas where museums and cultural institutions might value her expertise. Advice that ignored the financial impossibility of moving when she couldn't afford current living expenses, let alone security deposits and moving costs, required for establishing residence in expensive metropolitan areas where such opportunities might exist. The isolation that had accompanied Rebecca's financial crisis was compounded by the well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice from friends and former colleagues who didn't understand the practical constraints of her situation. Suggestions to network with other museum professionals ignored the reality that most of her contacts were employed by institutions facing their own budget constraints and hiring freezes. Recommendations to pursue freelance consulting work overlooked the fact that such opportunities required existing client relationships and financial resources for business development that Rebecca didn't possess. Even family support, while emotionally meaningful, couldn't address the practical challenges of Rebecca's circumstances. Her sister Jennifer's offer of temporary housing in Seattle came with conditions that would require Rebecca to abandon her job search efforts in North Carolina while starting over in a city where she had no professional connections, or familiarity with local cultural institutions. The decision represented choosing between maintaining some elements of the life she had built with David versus accepting help that would require abandoning everything familiar during an already traumatic period. More complex was Rebecca's recognition that accepting family assistance might provide short-term stability, while eliminating her independence and sense of agency during a period when regaining control over her circumstances felt essential for emotional recovery. The grief counseling sessions with Dr. Brennan had emphasized the importance of maintaining some aspects of personal autonomy while addressing practical needs, a balance that seemed increasingly difficult to achieve as her options continued to narrow. The evening hours that Rebecca now spent researching debt consolidation options and financial assistance programs had become exercises in confronting the inadequacy of social safety nets for people whose circumstances didn't fit standard categories of need. Her income exceeded eligibility thresholds for most assistance programs, while her debt levels exceeded the capacity of nonprofit credit counseling services to provide meaningful relief. The middle-class professional background that had once provided security now created obstacles to accessing help designed for people with different economic profiles. Most demoralizing was Rebecca's discovery that the financial assistance programs available through local charitable organizations were designed primarily for temporary emergency relief rather than the comprehensive debt resolution that her situation required. Food pantries and utility assistance could address immediate needs, but couldn't prevent foreclosure or eliminate the accumulated debt that would continue creating financial pressure regardless of temporary support. The legal aid services available for foreclosure defense were similarly limited, offering guidance on procedural requirements and timeline extensions, but unable to provide alternatives that would allow Rebecca to maintain homeownership without stable income sufficient to resume mortgage payments. The attorneys she consulted confirmed that her best option was negotiating terms for voluntary sale. That might minimize credit damage while accepting the loss of her home and the equity she and David had built over 13 years of ownership. But it was during one of these depressing conversations with a housing counselor that Rebecca first articulated the possibility she had been reluctant to consider directly. What if I use my remaining resources for something completely different? She had asked Maria Santos, the nonprofit counselor who had been helping Rebecca understand her foreclosure options. Instead of trying to delay the inevitable, what if I invested in an opportunity that might create income rather than just preserving what's left of my savings? Maria's response had been professionally cautious but personally understanding. Sometimes unconventional approaches make sense when conventional solutions haven't worked, she had acknowledged. But any investment would need to have realistic potential for generating income quickly enough to address your immediate needs while building longer-term stability. The time frame for recovery from your current situation requires solutions that can provide both immediate relief and sustainable improvement. The conversation had crystallized Rebecca's recognition that incremental improvements to her current circumstances weren't sufficient to address the magnitude of her financial crisis. The part-time employment she had been able to secure provided income that was inadequate for maintaining housing costs, while the debt accumulated during David's illness would require years to resolve even with significant improvement in her earning capacity. Conventional approaches to financial recovery assumed gradual progress over extended time frames that didn't align with the urgent deadlines created by foreclosure proceedings and accumulating penalties. Perhaps more importantly, the conventional employment opportunities available to Rebecca offered no connection to the professional expertise and personal interests that had defined her working life with David. The prospect of spending years in customer service or administrative roles while gradually paying down debt felt like accepting a diminished version of herself that honored neither her capabilities nor David's memory of their shared commitment to work that created cultural and educational value. The depot in Millbrook represented something entirely different, an opportunity that could potentially utilize her professional expertise, while creating something meaningful that extended beyond merely personal financial recovery. Historic preservation work aligned with the values she and David had shared about protecting cultural heritage while contributing to community development. The project would be challenging and uncertain, but it would also be authentic to who she was and what she cared about in ways that conventional employment couldn't match. Yet acknowledging these emotional and professional attractions to the depot project didn't resolve the fundamental financial obstacles that made such an undertaking seem completely impractical. The $500 auction price represented her entire liquid assets, money that needed to cover essential expenses while she continued job searching and navigating foreclosure proceedings. Using those funds for property acquisition would eliminate her financial safety net during a period when unexpected expenses could create catastrophic consequences. The risk assessment was daunting, regardless of how Rebecca analyzed the decision. Purchasing the depot would commit her to property ownership responsibilities that could generate additional financial obligations through taxes, insurance, and emergency repairs, while providing no immediate income or housing that could address her current crisis. The building's condition would require significant investment before generating any practical value, investment that Rebecca had no realistic means of providing given her current circumstances. But as Rebecca researched the depot's history and Millbrook's economic context throughout that week, she began to recognize that every decision available to her involved significant risks and uncertain outcomes. Continuing her current approach of part-time employment and gradual debt repayment offered no realistic path to financial stability given the magnitude of her obligations and limited earning potential in available positions. Accepting family assistance would provide short-term relief, while potentially compromising her long-term independence and professional development. Perhaps the choice wasn't between a safe conventional approach and a risky unconventional opportunity, but rather between different types of risks that offered varying potential for meaningful improvement in her circumstances.
Wow.
The depot represented a risk that aligned with her professional expertise and personal values, while offering possibilities for creating something significant that could provide both financial and emotional returns. The other options available involved different risks that seemed more likely to lead to gradual diminishment of her capabilities and aspirations. By Wednesday evening, exactly 1 week after first seeing the auction listing, Rebecca had made a decision that she couldn't entirely explain or justify through rational analysis. She would attend the auction the following morning, and, if the bidding remained at the minimum level, she would purchase the depot with her remaining $500. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, representing either the worst possible choice she could make or the first authentic decision she had made since David's death. She spent that night surrounded by David's engineering journals and her own research files about Victorian-era architecture, drawing connections between his systematic approach to complex technical problems and her understanding of historical preservation challenges. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt engaged with work that utilized her expertise while honoring the collaborative approach she and David had brought to projects throughout their marriage. The woman who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of prioritizing competing financial obligations, suddenly energized by the complexity of developing preservation strategies for a historically significant building. The challenge felt manageable because it required skills she possessed and approaches she understood, even if the specific application was unfamiliar. Most importantly, it felt like moving toward possibilities rather than merely managing decline. As Rebecca prepared for the auction, that would either represent the beginning of an extraordinary opportunity or the final mistake in a series of devastating financial decisions. She realized that she was finally making a choice based on hope, rather than fear. The outcome was uncertain, but the direction felt authentic to everything she valued about creating meaningful work that honored both professional expertise and personal commitment to preserving cultural heritage for future generations. The drive to Millbrook on Thursday morning took Rebecca through mountain landscapes that she and David had explored during their early years in western North Carolina, when weekend adventures had represented opportunities for discovery rather than desperate attempts to find alternatives to financial ruin. The 40-mile journey on winding two-lane roads provided time for Rebecca to question her decision repeatedly, while simultaneously feeling more energized than she had experienced since David's death. As if moving toward an uncertain but authentic choice had restored some essential part of herself that months of survival-focused decision-making had gradually eroded. Millbrook appeared around a curve in Highway 108 exactly as Rebecca remembered from that long-ago visit with David. a small mountain community nestled in a valley where the Little Pigeon River created fertile bottomland that had once supported tobacco farming and now hosted modest residential development. The town's main street stretched for 6 blocks along the old railroad corridor, lined with buildings that reflected both historical significance and the economic challenges facing many rural North Carolina communities in the post-industrial era. The architectural integrity of Millbrook's downtown was immediately apparent to Rebecca's trained eye, revealing a community that had maintained much of its late 19th and early 20th century built environment despite the economic pressures that had eliminated similar historic districts in other small towns throughout the region. The buildings showed various states of maintenance and occupancy, from carefully restored storefronts, housing contemporary businesses, to vacant structures that displayed for sale or for lease signs, indicating ongoing struggles to maintain commercial viability. But what struck Rebecca most forcefully was the potential she could recognize in Millbrook's physical infrastructure and geographic setting, possibilities that seemed invisible to others but were obvious to someone with her background in understanding how historical assets could support contemporary economic development. The town's location provided convenient access to outdoor recreation opportunities that attracted increasing numbers of tourists, while its authentic historical character offered the type of cultural experience that heritage tourism initiatives were designed to promote. The depot building dominated the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue. Its substantial brick and frame construction is designed to accommodate the heavy passenger and freight traffic that had justified the railroad's extension into this remote mountain valley during the 1880s economic expansion. Despite for decades of abandonment, the structure retained the imposing presence that Victorian-era architects had intended for public buildings that symbolized progress and community prosperity during the optimistic years following Civil War Reconstruction. Rebecca parked across the street from the depot and spent several minutes studying the building's exterior condition before the auction began, noting details that weren't visible in the online listing photographs. The foundation appeared solid, constructed from locally quarried stone that had weathered well despite decades of neglect. The brick walls showed some deterioration around window openings where moisture infiltration had occurred, but the overall structural integrity seemed sound based on her visual assessment from the street. Most encouraging was the survival of architectural details that indicated quality craftsmanship throughout the building's construction. The decorative brickwork around windows and doors featured patterns and textures that demonstrated skilled masonry, while the surviving woodwork displayed the intricate millwork that characterized substantial public buildings from the 1880s. These elements represented significant value that would be expensive to recreate if damaged or destroyed, making their preservation both historically important and economically advantageous for any restoration effort. The setting itself provided advantages that Rebecca hadn't fully appreciated from the auction listing description. The depot's prominent corner location offered visibility from multiple directions, while providing ample space for parking and landscaping that could enhance the building's presentation for commercial or cultural uses. The adjacent railroad corridor, though no longer serving active rail traffic, had been converted to a walking trail that connected Millbrook with neighboring communities, creating pedestrian access that could support retail or hospitality businesses. More intriguingly, Rebecca noticed that several buildings within walking distance of the depot showed signs of recent renovation and new business development, suggesting economic activity that might support additional commercial ventures if the depot could be restored to functional condition. A coffee shop, art gallery, an outdoor equipment retailer indicated entrepreneurial energy and tourist interest that could provide market demand for appropriately developed cultural or commercial space. The county auction was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. in the parking lot adjacent to the depot, with the railroad property listed as the third item in a series of tax-delinquent properties being sold to recover unpaid obligations. Rebecca arrived early to observe the process and assess potential competition from other bidders who might be interested in the depot, though she recognized that her $500 limit would quickly be exceeded if serious developers or investors participated in the bidding. Small group of attendees gathering for the auction appeared to consist primarily of local residents, curious about the proceedings rather than potential purchasers with specific interest in acquiring property. Rebecca counted fewer than 20 people, most of whom seemed to know each other and were engaged in conversations about community issues rather than property. Acquisition strategies. Casual atmosphere suggested limited commercial interest in the available properties, potentially creating favorable conditions for someone willing to bid on unconventional real estate. County auctioneer Harold Morrison began the proceedings with bureaucratic efficiency, explaining legal requirements and liability limitations, while emphasizing that all properties were being sold as is with no warranties regarding condition, environmental compliance, or development potential. The disclaimers were extensive and somewhat intimidating, reminding purchasers that they would assume complete responsibility for addressing any problems or violations associated with their acquisitions. The first two properties, a small residential lot with foundation remnants and a commercial building requiring extensive structural repairs, attracted minimal interest and sold for amounts close to their minimum bids, suggesting that Rebecca's assessment about limited competition might be accurate. When Morrison announced the depot property, describing it as approximately 2,400 square feet of railroad depot built in 1883, requiring significant renovation, minimum bid $500, Rebecca felt her heart rate increase despite her preparation for this moment. "Do I hear $500? Morrison called, scanning the small crowd for initial interest. Rebecca raised her bidding card with a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and completely foreign, representing the first time she had ever bid on real estate, and possibly the most impulsive financial decision she had made since her teenage years. The auctioneer acknowledged her bid, while looking for competing offers that didn't materialize from the other attendees. "I have $500, looking for $600, Morrison continued, allowing sufficient time for response before advancing through the traditional auction sequence. $500 going once, $500 going twice, ... Rebecca held her breath, recognizing that she was moments away from either purchasing a historic building or losing the opportunity that had captured her. Imagination during the previous week of research and soul-searching sold the bidder number. 7 for $500, Morrison announced with professional matter-of-factness, already consulting his paperwork for the next property, while Rebecca struggled to process what had just occurred. She had purchased a 140-year-old railroad depot with her last $500, a decision that represented either remarkable courage or spectacular foolishness. Depending on perspectives, she wasn't prepared to consider at that moment. The paperwork processing required another hour at the county administrative building. Rebecca learned additional details about the depot that hadn't been included in the auction listing. The property included not only the depot building, but also approximately 1 acre of surrounding land that had once served railroad operations, creating development potential that extended beyond merely restoring the existing structure. More significantly, the building was already listed on the North Carolina State Historic Register, providing access to preservation grants and tax credits that could help offset restoration costs. County Clerk Patricia Williams explained these benefits while processing Rebecca's purchase documents, noting that historic designation could provide substantial financial advantages for preservation projects, while creating restrictions on modifications that would require approval from state historical agencies. "The designation is both an asset and a constraint," Williams explained. "It opens funding opportunities, but limits what changes you can make to the building's exterior and historically significant interior features." Rebecca signed the deed, transferred documents while part of her mind marveled at the surreal experience of becoming a property owner through an investment that represented everything she had left after David's death and their financial catastrophe. The transaction felt simultaneously momentous and anticlimactic, requiring only routine paperwork to transfer. Ownership of a building that might become either the foundation for rebuilding her life or an additional burden that would accelerate her financial collapse. But as Rebecca drove back to Asheville that afternoon, she experienced a sense of purpose and excitement that had been absent from her life since David's illness had begun transforming their shared future into a series of devastating losses. For the first time in months, she was moving toward possibilities rather than merely attempting to minimize damage from circumstances beyond her control. The depot represented opportunity rather than obligation, potential rather than problems, that required management through careful limitation of expectations. The building's historical significance provided intellectual engagement that connected with Rebecca's professional expertise, while offering practical applications that could create economic value beyond academic appreciation. Her graduate research on post-Civil War transportation infrastructure had examined exactly the type of rural depot she had just purchased, providing knowledge that could inform restoration decisions while identifying historical features that should be preserved or researched for their documentary value. More personally, the depot project represented continuation of the collaborative approach to meaningful work that she and David had planned to pursue during retirement. When his engineering expertise and her historical knowledge could be combined for preservation projects that created cultural and educational benefits for communities like Millbrook, while David couldn't participate directly, the values and approaches they had developed together could guide Rebecca's work in ways that honored their partnership while creating something significant that extended beyond personal recovery. That evening, Rebecca spread her research materials about the depot and Millbrook's history across her kitchen table, creating a workspace that felt familiar and energizing after months of focusing on survival rather than creative problem-solving. Her academic training had emphasized the importance of thorough research before beginning any preservation project, understanding not only the building's architectural significance, but also its role in community development and regional economic history. The depot's construction in 1883 had coincided with the expansion of railroad service into western North Carolina's mountain counties, part of a broader effort to connect isolated agricultural communities with urban markets while providing access to natural resources like timber and minerals that could support industrial development. The timing placed the building within the post-Reconstruction period, when Southern states were rebuilding infrastructure and economic systems after the devastation of the Civil War. Rebecca's research revealed that the railroad line through Millbrook had been financed through a combination of private investment and federal land grants designed to encourage transportation development in mountainous regions where construction costs exceeded potential profits without government subsidies. The engineering challenges of building rail lines through Appalachian terrain had required innovative solutions and substantial financial resources, making depot construction a significant investment that reflected confidence in the region's economic potential. The architectural design of the Millbrook Depot incorporated elements typical of rural Southern railroad stations from the 1880s, including separate waiting areas for white and black passengers as required by Jim Crow segregation, laws that governed public facilities throughout the post-Reconstruction South. Understanding this historical context was essential for developing preservation approaches that acknowledged the building's complete history while creating educational opportunities that addressed difficult aspects of regional heritage with appropriate sensitivity and accuracy. More encouraging for restoration planning was Rebecca's discovery that the depot had been designed by architect William P. Henderson, whose firm had specialized in railroad structures throughout the Southeast during the late 19th century. Henderson's depot designs were known for incorporating high-quality materials and craftsmanship that had enabled many of his buildings to survive decades of use and abandonment, suggesting that the Millbrook structure might be in better condition than its exterior appearance indicated. The historical documentation Rebecca was able to locate included original architectural drawings and construction specifications that could guide restoration work while ensuring compliance with historical preservation standards required for buildings listed on state and federal historic registers. These materials represented invaluable resources that could prevent costly mistakes while helping secure grants and tax credits available for projects that maintained architectural integrity according to professional preservation standards. But perhaps most intriguing was Rebecca's discovery of references to the depot's role during the final months of the Civil War, when Confederate forces had used mountain railroad lines to transport supplies and personnel as Union armies advanced through Virginia and the Carolinas. Several historical accounts mentioned Millbrook as a temporary staging area for Confederate government officials and treasury assets being evacuated from Richmond. During the chaotic weeks preceding the capital's fall in April 1865, these references were fragmentary and required additional research to verify their accuracy. Why? But they suggested that the depot might have historical significance extending beyond its architectural and transportation heritage. If documented evidence could be located proving Confederate treasury operations at Millbrook, the building's historical value would increase substantially while potentially attracting research interest from Civil War historians and preservation organizations with resources for supporting significant archaeological and historical investigation. The possibility added another. County Clerk Patricia Williams explained these benefits while processing Rebecca's purchase documents, noting that historic designation could provide substantial financial advantages for preservation projects, while creating restrictions on modifications that would require approval from state historical agencies. The designation is both an asset and a constraint, Williams explained. It opens funding opportunities, but limits what changes you can make to the building's exterior and historically significant interior features. Rebecca signed the deed, transferred documents while part of her mind marveled at the surreal experience of becoming a property owner through an investment that represented everything she had left after David's death and their financial catastrophe. The transaction felt simultaneously momentous and anticlimactic, requiring only routine paperwork to transfer. Ownership of a building that might become either the foundation for rebuilding her life or an additional burden that would accelerate her financial collapse. But as Rebecca drove back to Asheville that afternoon, she experienced a sense of purpose and excitement that had been absent from her life since David's illness had begun transforming their shared future into a series of devastating losses. For the first time in months, she was moving toward possibilities rather than merely attempting to minimize damage from circumstances beyond her control. The depot represented opportunity rather than obligation, potential rather than problems, that required management through careful limitation of expectations. The building's historical significance provided intellectual engagement that connected with Rebecca's professional expertise, while offering practical applications that could create economic value beyond academic appreciation. Her graduate research on post-Civil War transportation infrastructure had examined exactly the type of rural depot she had just purchased, providing knowledge that could inform restoration decisions. Understanding these financial mechanisms required expertise that Rebecca didn't possess, but her research identified consultants and attorneys who specialized in structuring historic preservation projects to maximize available incentives while ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements. The professional fees for such services represented additional expenses, but the potential returns justified investment in proper planning and documentation that could secure substantial financial benefits. By the end of her first week as depot owner, Rebecca had developed preliminary preservation strategies that addressed both immediate stabilization needs and longer-term restoration goals. The most urgent priorities involved securing the building against further weather damage and conducting professional structural assessments that would inform decisions about renovation approaches and budget requirements. The roof repairs needed to prevent additional water damage would cost approximately $8,000, according to estimates from local contractors, an amount that exceeded Rebecca's available resources but could potentially be financed through emergency preservation grants designed to prevent loss of historically significant structures. Her applications for such funding would require documentation that she was developing through photographic surveys and historical research that demonstrated the building's significance. More comprehensive restoration work would require substantially larger investments. But Rebecca's research had identified multiple funding sources that could support different phases of the project, properly coordinated through strategic planning and phased implementation. The key was developing approaches that created immediate benefits while building toward larger goals that could attract ongoing financial support from various sources. Most importantly, Rebecca's week of intensive preservation research had restored her sense of professional competence and personal agency in ways that months of job searching and debt management had gradually eroded. Working on challenges that utilized her expertise while creating something meaningful for both personal and community benefit provided. Psychological benefits that transcended merely financial considerations, though financial sustainability remained essential for any long-term success. The depot project was beginning to feel like exactly the type of work she and David had planned to pursue together, combining historical preservation with community development while creating educational opportunities that honored cultural heritage. While David couldn't participate directly, the approaches and values they had developed together could guide Rebecca's work in ways that maintained connection to their shared vision while adapting to her current circumstances and capabilities. As Rebecca prepared for the next phase of her preservation work, she recognized that purchasing the depot had already transformed her relationship to her financial crisis in fundamental ways. Instead of merely managing decline and minimizing losses, she was actively working toward creating value and opportunity that could provide both personal stability and community benefits. The shift from survival mode to development mode had restored her sense of agency and professional identity in ways that conventional employment opportunities couldn't have achieved. The challenges ahead were substantial and uncertain, but they were challenges that required her expertise and aligned with her values, rather than problems that made her feel professionally irrelevant and personally diminished. For the first time since David's death, Rebecca was excited about the future rather than merely anxious about avoiding catastrophic outcomes. The depot had become not just a building project, but a pathway toward rebuilding her life according to principles that honored both her professional capabilities and personal commitment to creating something meaningful that extended beyond individual circumstances. The first morning, Rebecca unlocked the depot's heavy oak doors as the building's legal owner. She experienced a complex mixture of exhilaration and terror that accurately reflected the magnitude of what she had committed herself to achieving. The building's interior, revealed in natural light streaming through tall windows that had somehow survived decades of abandonment without significant damage, displayed both the architectural quality that justified her investment and the overwhelming scope of work that would be required to transform potential into reality. The main passenger waiting room stretched 40 feet in length, with 14-foot ceilings that created an impressively spacious environment despite the accumulated debris and water damage that marked decades of neglect. The original heart pine flooring, though scarred and stained from roof leaks, remained structurally sound and displayed the wide plank construction that was characteristic of quality 10th century millwork. More remarkably, the room's decorative elements had survived better than Rebecca had expected from her exterior assessment, with ornate plaster moldings and carved woodwork that retained enough integrity to guide accurate restoration. The ticket office featured built-in cabinetry with brass hardware that had developed a beautiful patina beneath layers of dust and grime, while the station master's office contained a massive oak desk and filing system that appeared to have been abandoned in place when rail service ended in 1982. These furnishings represented both historical artifacts that enhanced the building's significance and practical elements that could support contemporary uses if properly restored and maintained. But the depot's condition also revealed challenges that would require immediate attention before any restoration work could proceed effectively. Water infiltration through the deteriorated roof had created structural damage to ceiling joists and wall systems that would need professional assessment and repair before other renovation work could begin safely. The electrical system, installed sometime during the 1950s, was completely inadequate for modern usage and would require total replacement according to current codes and safety standards. More concerning was evidence of wildlife intrusion through broken windows and deteriorated exterior walls, creating health and safety issues that would need addressing before Rebecca could spend extended time in the building or allow others to visit for assessment and planning purposes. The basement area, originally used for coal storage and mechanical systems, showed signs of periodic flooding that had created mold and structural issues, requiring specialized remediation before the space could be safely accessed or utilized. Despite these obvious challenges, Rebecca felt energized rather than overwhelmed as she documented the building's condition through systematic photography and notes that would support grant applications and contractor estimates. Her museum training had taught her to assess artifacts and architectural elements for both their current condition and restoration. Understanding these financial mechanisms required expertise that Rebecca didn't possess. But her research identified consultants and attorneys who specialized in structuring historic preservation projects to maximize available incentives while ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements. The professional fees for such services represented additional expenses, but the potential returns justified investment in proper planning and documentation that could secure substantial financial benefits. By the end of her first week as depot owner, Rebecca had developed preliminary preservation strategies that addressed both immediate stabilization needs and longer-term restoration goals. The most urgent priorities involved securing the building against further weather damage and conducting professional structural assessments that would inform decisions about renovation approaches and budget requirements. The roof repairs needed to prevent additional water damage would cost approximately $8,000, according to estimates from local contractors, an amount that exceeded Rebecca's available resources but could potentially be financed through emergency preservation grants designed to prevent loss of historically significant structures. Her applications for such funding would require documentation that she was developing through photographic surveys and historical research that demonstrated the building's significance. More comprehensive restoration work would require substantially larger investments. But Rebecca's research had identified multiple funding sources that could support different phases of the project, properly coordinated through strategic planning and phased implementation. The key was developing approaches that created immediate benefits while building toward larger goals that could attract ongoing financial support from various sources. Most importantly, Rebecca's week of intensive preservation research had restored her sense of professional competence and personal agency in ways that months of job searching and debt management had gradually eroded. Working on challenges that utilized her expertise while creating something meaningful for both personal and community benefit provided psychological benefits that transcended merely financial considerations, though financial sustainability remained essential for any long-term success. Rebecca's research identified several regional firms that specialized in historic preservation, including Henderson Restoration Company, whose founder James Henderson was the great-grandson of William P. Henderson, the architect who had designed the Millbrook Depot. Family connection created both historical continuity and practical advantages, since Henderson Restoration maintained archives of original architectural drawings and construction specifications for many of their ancestors' buildings throughout the Southeast. The consultation with James Henderson provided Rebecca's first professional assessment of the depot's condition and restoration requirements, confirming her optimistic evaluation of the building's structural integrity while identifying specific priorities for preservation work. Henderson's estimate for comprehensive restoration ranged from $85,000 to $120,000, depending on the level of historical accuracy desired and the extent of modern conveniences incorporated into the final design. The good news is that your building is fundamentally solid, Henderson explained during their initial meeting. William P. Henderson designed these depots to last, and the quality of construction has protected the structure despite decades of deferred maintenance. The challenging news is that proper restoration will require significant investment in specialized materials and techniques that ensure historical authenticity while meeting contemporary building codes. The cost estimates were daunting, but not entirely unexpected, given Rebecca's research about historic preservation projects. More encouraging was Henderson's assessment that the work could be phased to address critical issues first while building toward comprehensive restoration as funding became available. The immediate priority was stabilizing the roof and addressing water infiltration issues that were causing ongoing damage to interior systems and finishes. Henderson's company could complete emergency stabilization work for approximately $12,000, which would prevent further deterioration, while providing time to secure funding for more comprehensive restoration phases. The estimate exceeded Rebecca's available resources, but it represented a manageable first step that would protect her investment, while demonstrating commitment to preservation that could strengthen grant applications and partnership proposals. Rebecca's financing strategy involved combining multiple funding sources to support different aspects of the restoration work while maintaining flexibility to adapt plans. Based on available resources and emerging opportunities, her research had identified 7 potential funding programs that could provide grants, tax credits, or lunarist loans for qualifying historic preservation projects, each with different requirements and evaluation criteria that would need careful coordination. The most promising immediate opportunity was the North Carolina Emergency Historic Preservation Fund, which provided grants up to $15,000 for critical stabilization work on buildings facing imminent threat of loss due to structural deterioration or environmental damage. Rebecca's application emphasized the depot's architectural significance and community importance while documenting the urgent need for roof repairs that would prevent irreversible damage to historically significant interior features. The application process required extensive documentation that Rebecca was uniquely qualified to provide given her museum background and academic training in historical research methods. Her submission included architectural photography, historical research demonstrating the building's significance, letters of support from local officials and preservation organizations, and detailed technical specifications for proposed stabilization, work that met professional preservation standards. Now, more complex but potentially more valuable was Rebecca's application for historic tax credits. That could provide up to $48,000 in federal and state credits based on Henderson's restoration cost estimates. The tax credit program required pre-approval of restoration plans and ongoing compliance monitoring, but offered substantial financial benefits that could make comprehensive restoration economically feasible if properly structured and managed. Rebecca's tax credit application required collaboration with specialized attorneys and accountants who understood the regulatory requirements and structuring options for maximizing available benefits. The professional fees for this expertise represented additional expenses, but the potential returns justified investment and proper planning that could secure substantial financial advantages while ensuring compliance with complex federal and state regulations. Simultaneously, Rebecca was developing partnership proposals for academic institutions and cultural organizations that might provide resources and expertise in exchange for research access and educational programming opportunities. Her outreach to the University of North Carolina's Public History program had generated interest from faculty members who specialized in transportation history and material culture studies. Related to 19th century infrastructure development, Dr. Cecil Catherine Martinez, who directed UNC's Historic Preservation Program, visited the depot during Rebecca's second week of ownership and immediately recognized both the building's research potential and Rebecca's qualifications for managing a significant preservation project. This is exactly the type of community-based preservation work that our students need experience with, Dr. Martinez explained. We could potentially provide graduate student researchers and preservation specialists in exchange for case study access and fieldwork opportunities. The university partnership could provide substantial value through student labor, faculty expertise, and access to specialized equipment and resources that would be expensive to obtain commercially. Graduate students in historic preservation and public history programs needed hands-on experience with real preservation projects, while faculty researchers could pursue academic interests in transportation history and regional economic development using the depot as a primary source. More significantly, university involvement would enhance Rebecca's credibility with funding agencies and preservation organizations that evaluated projects based on professional expertise and institutional support. Academic partnerships demonstrated serious commitment to preservation standards and educational outcomes that aligned with the public benefits that most grant programs were designed to achieve. Rebecca's outreach to tourism and economic development organizations had revealed additional partnership opportunities that could provide both resources and markets for depot programming once restoration. Rebecca's research identified several regional firms that specialized in historic preservation, including Henderson Restoration Company, whose founder James Henderson was the great-grandson of William P. Henderson, the architect who had designed the Millbrook Depot. Family connection created both historical continuity and practical advantages. Since Henderson Restoration maintained archives of original architectural drawings and construction specifications for many of their ancestors' buildings throughout the Southeast, the consultation with James Henderson provided Rebecca's first professional assessment of the depot's condition and restoration requirements, confirming her optimistic evaluation of the building's structural integrity while identifying specific priorities for preservation work. Henderson's estimate for comprehensive restoration ranged from $85,000 to $120,000, depending on the level of historical accuracy desired and the extent of modern conveniences incorporated into the final design. The good news is that your building is fundamentally solid, Henderson explained during their initial meeting. William P. Henderson designed these depots to last, and the quality of construction has protected the structure despite decades of deferred maintenance. The challenging news is that proper restoration will require significant investment in specialized materials and techniques that ensure historical authenticity while meeting contemporary building codes. The cost estimates were daunting, but not entirely unexpected, given Rebecca's research about historic preservation projects. More encouraging was Henderson's assessment that the work could be phased to address critical issues first while building toward comprehensive restoration as funding became available. The immediate priority was stabilizing the roof and addressing water infiltration issues that were causing ongoing damage to interior systems and finishes. Henderson's company could complete emergency stabilization work for approximately $12,000, which would prevent further deterioration, while providing time to secure funding for more comprehensive restoration phases. The estimate exceeded Rebecca's available resources, but it represented a manageable first step that would protect her investment, while demonstrating commitment to preservation that could strengthen grant applications and partnership proposals. Rebecca's financing strategy involved combining multiple funding sources to support different aspects of the restoration work while maintaining flexibility to adapt plans based on available resources and emerging opportunities. The university partnership with CU was advancing through formal agreement negotiations that would provide student researchers and faculty supervision for historical investigation and documentation work beginning in the spring semester. The collaboration would include archaeological assessment of the depot site, oral history collection from community members who remembered the building's operational period, and archival research to document the structure's role in regional transportation and economic development. More immediately, Rebecca had secured commitments from local volunteers who could assist with cleaning and basic maintenance work that would prepare the building for professional restoration activities. The volunteer labor would provide significant cost savings while building community investment in the project's success and creating opportunities for skills development and historical education among participants. Most crucially, Rebecca's preservation planning had identified realistic pathways for financing restoration work through combinations of grants, tax credits, and earned revenue that could provide both project funding and personal income during the extended period required for comprehensive renovation. The financial projections were optimistic, but based on careful research and professional consultation that provided confidence in their achievability. The depot project was beginning to feel like exactly the type of meaningful work that Rebecca had been seeking since David's death, utilizing her professional expertise while creating something valuable for both personal recovery and community development. The challenges were substantial, but they were challenges that required capabilities she possessed, rather than skills she needed to develop or compromises that diminished her sense of professional identity and personal values. Perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's commitment to depot restoration. It restored her sense of agency and purpose during a period when external circumstances had seemed to eliminate most possibilities for meaningful choice or positive change. Instead of merely responding to financial pressures and employment limitations, she was actively creating opportunities that aligned with her expertise and values while contributing to preservation of cultural heritage that extended beyond individual circumstances. The transformation from desperate job seeker to preservation project manager had occurred gradually, but fundamentally, reflecting both Rebecca's professional capabilities and her willingness to pursue unconventional approaches. When conventional solutions proved inadequate, The depot had become not just a building restoration project, but a vehicle for rebuilding her life according to principles that honored both her relationship with David and her commitment to work that created lasting value for communities and future generations. As Rebecca prepared for the next phase of preservation work, which would involve implementing emergency stabilization measures, while continuing to develop funding partnerships and community relationships, she recognized that purchasing the depot had already achieved something essential for her recovery from the compounded losses that had defined the previous 2 years. She was no longer merely surviving circumstances beyond her control, but actively creating possibilities that reflected her expertise, values, and commitment to building something meaningful from what others had abandoned as worthless. The leap of faith represented by spending her last $500 on an abandoned railroad depot was proving to be exactly the type of authentic decision that could create genuine alternatives to the diminished expectations and limited opportunities that had seemed to define her available choices. Sometimes the most rational decision was to make choices based on values and capabilities rather than fears and limitations. Even when the immediate outcomes remained uncertain and the challenges appeared overwhelming to external observers who couldn't recognize the expertise and determination that made seemingly impossible projects achievable. 3 weeks into her depot restoration project, Rebecca was documenting water damage in the building's basement when her flashlight illuminated something that would transform not only her personal circumstances, but the entire understanding of Civil War history in western North Carolina. What appeared to be an irregularity in the stone foundation wall revealed itself upon closer inspection to be the edge of a carefully concealed metal door set flush with the masonry and covered by decades of accumulated grime and mineral deposits. From periodic flooding, the discovery occurred during Rebecca's methodical survey of the building's lower level, work that was required for her historic tax credit application and emergency preservation grant proposals. Her museum training had taught her to examine architectural features systematically, noting not only obvious elements but also anomalies that might indicate historical modifications or hidden structural components. The basement wall's stonework appeared consistent throughout, except for a section near the building's northeast corner, where the mortar pattern seemed slightly different from surrounding areas. Rebecca's initial assumption was that she had discovered evidence of later repairs or utility installations that had modified the original foundation, common occurrences in buildings that had been adapted for changing uses over their operational lifespans. But as she cleaned away accumulated debris and examined the area more carefully, the metal surface became apparent, revealing what was clearly a purpose-built access point rather than a random modification or repair. The concealed door measured approximately 18 inches square and featured a simple, bit robust latch mechanism that had been protected from corrosion by its sealed environment. Unlike the building's other metal components, which showed significant rust damage from decades of moisture exposure, the hidden door's hardware appeared to be in remarkably good condition, suggesting that it had been designed for long-term preservation. Rather than regular access, Rebecca's heart rate increased as she recognized the potential historical significance of her discovery. Hidden compartments and concealed storage areas were not uncommon in 19th century buildings, particularly in the post-Civil War South, where economic instability and political uncertainty had encouraged concealment of valuables. In her graduate research had included documentation of similar features in buildings throughout the region, though she had never expected to encounter such elements in her own preservation work. But before proceeding with any investigation of the concealed compartment, Rebecca recognized the importance of proper documentation and professional consultation. Historic preservation protocols required careful recording of any discoveries that might have archaeological or historical significance. The university partnership with CU was advancing through formal agreement negotiations that would provide student researchers and faculty supervision for historical investigation and documentation work beginning in the spring semester. The collaboration would include archaeological assessment of the depot site, oral history collection from community members who remembered the building's operational period, and archival research to document the structure's role in regional transportation and economic development. More immediately, Rebecca had secured commitments from local volunteers who could assist with cleaning and basic maintenance work that would prepare the building for professional restoration activities. The volunteer labor would provide significant cost savings while building community investment in the project's success and creating opportunities for skills development and historical education among participants. Most crucially, Rebecca's preservation planning had identified realistic pathways for financing restoration work through combinations of grants, tax credits, and earned revenue that could provide both project funding and personal income during the extended period required for comprehensive renovation. The financial projections were optimistic, but based on careful research and professional consultation that provided confidence in their achievability. The depot project was beginning to feel like exactly the type of meaningful work that Rebecca had been seeking since David's death, utilizing her professional expertise while creating something valuable for both personal recovery and community development. The challenges were substantial, but they were challenges that required capabilities she possessed, rather than skills she needed to develop or compromises that diminished her sense of professional identity and personal values. Perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's commitment to depot restoration. It restored her sense of agency and purpose during a period when external circumstances had seemed to eliminate most possibilities for meaningful choice or positive change. Instead of merely responding to financial pressures and employment limitations, she was actively creating opportunities that aligned with her expertise and values while contributing to. The documentary evidence suggests that substantial Confederate treasury assets moved through this region during April and May 1865. Dr. Harrison explained as the team prepared to open the concealed compartment. But we've never been able to locate physical evidence of these operations because most participants destroyed records and abandoned facilities when Union forces advanced into the area. This could provide the first direct archaeological evidence of Confederate treasury activities. In the North Carolina mountains, the compartment's opening required careful coordination between preservation and archaeological protocols to ensure that any contents were properly documented while maintaining the historical integrity of both the storage area and any artifacts it might contain. Dr. Chen supervised the process using specialized tools and documentation methods that would preserve the discovery's research, its value regardless of what might be found inside the concealed space. The metal door opened to reveal a brick-lined chamber approximately 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, constructed with the same high-quality masonry that characterized the depot's foundation work. The space had remained completely dry, despite the basement's periodic flooding, suggesting that its builders had anticipated long-term storage requirements and designed the compartment to protect valuable contents from environmental damage over extended periods. Most remarkably, the chamber contained a collection of wooden crates and metal containers that appeared to have been placed there deliberately and left undisturbed since the 1860s. The containers showed no signs of deterioration or tampering, their contents protected by the sealed environment that had preserved them in near-original condition for more than 150 years. Dr. Chen's careful removal and documentation of the containers revealed contents that exceeded even Dr. Harrison's optimistic expectations about their potential historical significance. The wooden crates contained hundreds of gold and silver coins bearing Confederate government markings, while the metal containers held government bonds, treasury notes, and official documents that provided unprecedented documentation of Confederate financial operations during the war's chaotic final weeks. But the most extraordinary discovery was a leather portfolio containing detailed records of Confederate treasury movements through western North Carolina, including specific documentation of assets deposited at the Millbrook Depot during April 1865 as Confederate officials attempted to preserve government resources while evacuating Richmond ahead of advancing Union forces. The records included signatures of Treasury officials, detailed inventories of deposited assets, and maps showing the locations of other concealed repositories throughout the region. "This is absolutely unprecedented," Dr. Harrison whispered, as he examined the Treasury records with white cotton gloves. These documents provide the missing pieces for understanding how Confederate government assets were distributed and concealed during the collapse of Richmond. We're looking at primary source evidence that historians have been seeking for more than a century. The gold and silver coins alone represented substantial monetary value, with preliminary estimates suggesting a total worth exceeding $2.3 million at current precious metal prices. But the historical significance of the discovery transcended its monetary value, providing documentation that would require rewriting textbooks about Confederate government operations and Civil War financial history throughout the Southeast. More personally significant for Rebecca was the legal determination that the discovered assets belonged to her as the property owner, since they had been abandoned for more than 150 years and represented Confederate government property that had no surviving legal claimants. While various government agencies and academic institutions expressed interest in studying and preserving the materials, Rebecca's ownership rights were clearly established under North Carolina property law and federal precedents regarding abandoned historical assets. The discovery transformed Rebecca's financial circumstances overnight, eliminating her debt obligations while providing resources that could support not only complete depot restoration but also establishment of a significant museum and research center focused on Civil War history and transportation heritage. The monetary value of the Confederate treasury assets was sufficient to fund comprehensive restoration work while creating an endowment that would ensure long-term operational sustainability. But perhaps more importantly, the discovery validated Rebecca's decision to pursue an unconventional approach to addressing her financial crisis, demonstrating that her expertise and instincts had led her to recognize value that others had overlooked for decades. The depot that county officials had considered a liability requiring demolition had revealed itself to be one of the most significant archaeological sites in North Carolina, containing primary source materials that would reshape academic understanding of Civil War history. The media attention that followed the discovery's announcement created national interest in Rebecca's story, transforming her from struggling widow to acclaimed preservationist whose intuitive recognition of historical significance had led to extraordinary archaeological discoveries. Television interviews, newspaper features, and magazine articles shared her journey from financial desperation to historical preservation success, inspiring others who faced similar challenges to consider unconventional approaches to creating opportunities from seemingly impossible circumstances. The publicity also generated substantial interest in visiting the depot once restoration work was completed, with tourism officials projecting that the site could attract more than 50,000 visitors annually based on the historical significance of the Confederate treasury discovery and the broader appeal of authentic Civil War sites throughout the Southeast. The tourism potential provided sustainable revenue projections that could support ongoing operations, while contributing to economic development through visitor spending and related business development. Rebecca's restoration work proceeded with resources and expertise that exceeded anything she could have imagined. When purchasing the building with her last $500, the historic tax credit application was expedited, given the discovery's national significance, while additional preservation grants provided funding for specialized conservation work that would properly preserve and display the Confederate treasury materials according to museum standards. The University of North Carolina partnership expanded to include collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution and leading Civil War research centers that recognized the depot site as providing unique opportunities for interdisciplinary research combining history, archaeology, and preservation studies. Graduate students and faculty researchers from throughout the country requested access to the site and materials for thesis projects and scholarly research that would advance academic understanding while creating educational programming for public access. Most meaningfully for Rebecca, the Depot project had evolved into exactly the type of collaborative work that she and David had envisioned pursuing together, combining historical preservation with community development while creating educational opportunities that honored cultural heritage for future generations. While David couldn't participate directly, the values and approaches they had developed together guided every aspect of the project in ways that maintained connection to their shared vision while adapting to circumstances that neither could have anticipated. The Millbrook Depot Museum and Research Center opened 18 months after Rebecca's initial discovery, featuring exhibitions that told the complete story of the building's construction, operational history, abandonment, and archaeological significance within the broader context of Civil War history and post-war economic development. The museum's programming included educational initiatives for local schools, research facilities for visiting scholars, and community events that connected residents with their local heritage while attracting visitors from throughout the region. Rebecca's role as museum director utilized every aspect of her professional training while providing the type of meaningful work that had motivated her original interest in museum careers. Her expertise in decorative arts, experience with collections management, and understanding of educational programming proved directly applicable to developing exhibitions and programs that made complex historical information accessible to diverse audiences while maintaining scholarly accuracy and research value. The museum's success created broader opportunities for Rebecca's expertise in historic preservation and museum development, leading to consulting work with other communities throughout North Carolina and neighboring states that wanted to develop heritage tourism attractions based on their historical assets. Her experience with the Depot project provided credibility and practical knowledge that proved valuable for advising other preservation efforts while creating additional income streams that enhanced her financial security. But perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's journey from financial desperation to professional fulfillment demonstrated the potential for authentic decisions based on expertise and values to create opportunities that transcended immediate circumstances and conventional expectations. Her willingness to risk everything on preserving something that others had written off as worthless had revealed not only hidden treasure, but also possibilities for creating meaningful work that honored both personal heritage and community needs. 5. Years after purchasing the Depot with her last $500, Rebecca welcomed her 100,000th museum visitor, a milestone that represented the transformation of both her personal circumstances and Millbrook's identity as a destination for heritage tourism and historical education. The celebration included representatives from major universities, preservation organizations, and government agencies that had supported the Depot's restoration while recognizing its significance for understanding Civil War history and demonstrating best practices for community-based preservation work. During her remarks at the anniversary celebration, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had begun with David's illness and financial catastrophe, continued through desperate decisions and unconventional choices, and resulted in discoveries that exceeded anything she could have imagined when facing foreclosure and professional irrelevance. Sometimes our worst circumstances create the conditions for recognizing opportunities that we might never have considered during more comfortable times, she observed. Sometimes what appears to be our biggest mistake becomes the doorway to possibilities we couldn't have planned or predicted. The Depot that had seemed like an impulsive waste of her last financial resources had become the foundation for a career that utilized all of her professional expertise while creating economic and educational benefits that extended far beyond individual recovery. The Confederate treasury discovery had provided financial security, but the preservation work itself had restored Rebecca's sense of purpose and professional identity in ways that money alone couldn't have achieved. Most remarkably, Rebecca's success with the Depot project had inspired similar preservation efforts throughout Western North Carolina. As other communities recognized that their overlooked historical assets might contain both cultural significance and economic potential that could support sustainable development while preserving regional heritage for future generations. The Depot had become a model for community-based preservation work that demonstrated how individual initiative could create broader benefits when aligned with professional expertise and community support. Rebecca's story had become an inspiration for others facing similar challenges, showing that authentic decisions based on values and capabilities rather than fears and limitations could create genuine alternatives to diminished expectations and constrained opportunities. The widow, who had once faced financial ruin and professional irrelevance, had become a nationally recognized expert in historic preservation whose work contributed to both scholarly understanding and community development throughout the region. But Beyond the professional recognition and financial security, Rebecca had achieved something more valuable: the restoration of hope and agency that had seemed permanently lost during the darkest period following David's death. The Depot project had provided not just economic recovery, but personal renewal that honored both her individual capabilities and the collaborative values she had shared with David throughout their marriage. As Rebecca looked toward the future, she recognized that the Depot's transformation from abandoned liability to nationally significant museum represented only the beginning of possibilities that could emerge when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances to recognize hidden value in what others had dismissed as worthless. Sometimes the most important discoveries required not just expertise and resources, but the courage to act on conviction when conventional wisdom suggested that such action was foolish or impossible. The train depot that had once symbolized a community's lost connections to broader economic opportunities had become a symbol of how individual determination, combined with professional expertise, could revive not just buildings, but entire communities, while preserving cultural heritage that might otherwise be lost to neglect in changing economic circumstances. Rebecca's leap of faith had proved that sometimes the most rational decision was to trust in values and capabilities rather than limitations and fears, even when the immediate outcomes remained uncertain and the challenges appeared overwhelming. Two observers who couldn't recognize the expertise and commitment that made seemingly impossible achievements possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.